Ahoy hoy, I'm Medio Morde, and this is How You Tristan. First off, I'd like to apologize, I've got some really bad allergies right now. So now that that's out of the way, the Tristan itself is a pretty scary little T1 frigate. I myself am not too keen on taking duels from the Tristan, unless I have an idea of what the enemy fit looks like, just because of their versatility and how scary they can be. So let's go ahead and take a look at the attributes to see what makes them so scary. So first off, we're getting a tracking speed bonus on our turrets and tracking and hit point bonus on our drones. So just with these two bonuses that we have here, we know that damage is going to apply very well from a Tristan. Tracking speed on our blasters is going to make them pretty lethal, and if we decide to go blasters for a brawl setup, and then hit points and tracking speed for drones just make them that much scarier. Drones already apply pretty well. With the extra tracking speed, we know that they're just going to apply that much better. On top of that, getting some hit points means that they'll survive a little bit if they do get targeted by the enemy. Alright, moving into the attributes. We have 550 hull points or structure points. This is quite high for frigates, and just if you remember from the slasher video, which only had 300 HP, it's quite a big difference. Pretty much this is the case for all Galente. Galente have a lot of structure, so keep that in mind when you're making your fits. Galente hulls especially need to always have a damage control, so avoid any fits that don't have damage controls with Galentes. Now here's part of the reason that this frigate is so scary. 25 megabits per second with light combat drones only using 5 megabits per second. That means that we can have a full flight of 5 combat drones out at once. So already that's about 100 DPS just from drones without doing anything to our power grid or CPU or fit on the frigate itself. And then of course we also have room for a few extras just in case they do pop a couple drones. Moving on, our hit points are 450. Not as good as a structure, but that's still a decent amount of armor hit points. So if we chose to armor tank it, we have that option. Then we finally have shield capacity of 350 hit points. So that's the least of the 3. So we know that this ship doesn't really want to be a shield ship. Going further down into the targeting section, we've got decent targeting range. So we won't need to be messing with that like we did with the slasher. We have a signature radius of 41. That just means this frigate looks a little bit larger to missiles and turrets, which means enemy damage will apply better than something like the slasher from the last video, which was small enough that we could avoid a lot of damage. So speed tanking this probably won't be our best option either. On top of that, we have 600 millimeter scan resolution, which is still pretty good. You're still going to be able to lock cruisers and whatnot fast enough to keep them from warping away from you from gates or stations, but you won't be catching any frigates or insta warpers with this guy. So although this ship can be used in a tackler in some scenarios, it's not optimal. You're better off with something like the slasher, or if you're Galente, the Atron. Finally, our maximum velocity is 315 meters per second. So in comparison, the Rifter is 365 meters per second base speed, so not as fast. Again, we're not really going to be speed tanking this, and as a result of the fact that this isn't that fast of a ship. Alright, let's move over to fittings. As we can see here, we have 2 turret hardpoints out of 3 high power slots. That means we always have 1 utility slot, so perfect for any neutralizers or Nosferatus if that's what you choose to do. Then we have 3 medium slots and 3 low slots. So with 3 mediums and 3 lows, we have a little bit of versatility, but at the same time, having 3 medium slots means we'll be needing to make a decision when we get to the medium slot section between capacitor boosters or web of fires, because we'll almost always have a propulsion mod and a disruptor or scrambler. And then finally, we have 3 low power slots, so that's a good amount, especially if you are going to wind up armor tanking it, or it also gives you some ability to add some damage. And then standard 3 rig slots. Moving forward, let's get into my Brawler setup first. So this is my Tristan with the Valamore Legacy skin. Let's go straight into my setup. So with my setup, the first thing I'd like you to take a look at is this right here, 170 DPS. That is insane levels of DPS for a Tech 1 frigate, especially one without any damage modifiers in the rigs or in the lows. So that's part of what makes this frigate so scary. If you chose to go damage, you can get assault frigate level damage. And if you remember, this damage is going to apply because we're getting tracking speed bonuses for both our guns and the drones themselves. Taking a look at the drones that we are using, I have 5 Hobgoblins and 3 Warriors. You could choose to go all Hobgoblins if you like, but the reason I take Warriors is if I have the sneaking suspicion that the enemy is using a reactive armor hardener, which will ramp up against a certain the incoming damage resistance type, then I will throw out some warriors to help reduce the thermal damage resistance that they're getting from their reactive armor hardener. All right, into the rig slots. First, we have 2 auxiliary nano pumps, which will increase the amount of repairs that we're getting, because I am an active setup. And then a small anti-explosive pump, which will help fill in the explosive hole that we had before. Into the guns, we have 2 light Ion Blaster 2s. The reason I'm using Ion Blaster 2s is the damage is already still really good. We're going to apply even better because they're a step down from neutrons, which are the largest small gun, and the fit's pretty tight on power grid. So you really don't need to go to neutrons, because if you do, then you're going to have to be using one of your module slots or your rig slots just to be able to fit the neutrons. So I don't think it's worth it. Our damage is already really good. Then we have a neutralizer. So this is really important because if we're fighting any active setups, which are pretty much the only thing that are going to be able to stand up to this as a result of the amount of damage that we're putting out, we want to gut them so that they can't do that for very long. Because with this setup, the idea is to get in quickly and burn them down with our high DPS as fast as we can. So with an active setup that's going to survive a little bit longer as a result of that, we want to neutralize them to take away their strength in tanking. Then we go Afterburner. Of course, when we're brawling, we pretty much want to take an Afterburner. And then we have a small capacitor booster. So remember earlier I talked about deciding between a web of fire or a capacitor booster. So if you're doing a buffer setup, you can go with a web here if you want. But because I am active repping and I'm going to be using this neutralizer pretty much for the whole fight, I want to be able to keep those things up. On top of the fact that I am using a reactive down here, and we want to keep that on. So I have to use a small capacitor booster instead of a web of fire. And then finally, a Scrambler in the mids, just in case the enemy decides to use a micro warp drive in the fight. This will pretty much just make them dead in the water. Going into the low slots, we are using an Ancillary Armor Repairer. Now the important thing about this to remember is that when you use an Ancillary Armor Repper, for this ship especially, when you're undocked and you're flying around, right-click your Ancillary Armor Repper and set the auto reload to off. Reason being is once you're done using that 8 nanite repair paste, if you don't have it set to off and you turn it off, it's going to spend quite a long time reloading the nanite repair paste, and you'll most likely die in that time period. So set the auto reload to off. You'll be repairing a lot less than when you had nanite repair paste, but some repair is better than no repair. So remember that. Set the auto reload to off. Now to counteract that a little bit, we have a reactive armor hardener. So by the time we use up all our nanite repair paste, and this is repairing a lot less, our resistances towards whatever the enemy's incoming damage is will have increased by a lot. Because as we know, a reactive armor hardener will ramp up towards the incoming damage. So that means that, if they're shooting primarily EM and thermal because they're energy turrets, then the reactive armor hardener will increase EM and thermal resistances. So that will help. By the time this runs out of nanite repair paste, we'll have increased resistances to the incoming damage, and the small amount of repairs that we're getting for this will actually be useful. And then finally, we do have a damage control. As we said earlier, this is really important for a Galente hull, especially with the amount of structure hit points that they have. On top of that, with the decreased amount of repairs that we're getting from this, we will be bleeding into structure while we fight. So basically, damage control, it's just super important. Always fit it when you can. And this is my Brawler setup. So the idea for this is basically just go in and gun them down as fast as I can with the high amount of DPS that we have. Now, let's go ahead and make a different kind of setup. And we're going to be making more use of the structure hit points that this ship has innately. All right, so strip my fitting here. All right. So first off, we're going to want to go ahead and make a micro warp drive setup. The reason we're going to want to make a micro warp drive setup is we're going to make this frigate a lot more versatile in the type of engagements it can take. So with the micro warp drive, it's going to be more versatile, but your primary form of combat is going to be kiting. So the good thing about kiting is it's very risk averse, and you have more control over the battle with a micro warp drive in a lot of ways. So let's go ahead and start off by putting the micro warp drive in. All right, so now we have our micro warp drive. And again, this is going to be good for nullsec as well as faction warfare, because a lot of times people don't think that you're going to have a micro warp drive in faction warfare, and especially in kiting. If you're in a faction warfare plex, the idea is you're going to be orbiting them at 18 kilometers, killing them, and they're going to have a hard time doing anything to you. This will give you the option to run away if you need to, if the blob starts to come in, rather than being, all in with an afterburner, and you have really no choice but to just try to kill that person as quickly as you can before the blob shows up so you can warp out. All right, so we got our micro warp drive in. Let's deal with the high slots first. So this is going to sound a little bit crazy, but believe it or not, it's pretty popular with this ship. So we're going to go into energy neutralizers, and we're going to put a full rack of neuts. So a full rack of neuts makes this ship extremely dangerous to any active reppers or any type of ship that needs energy to shoot its guns. And we will talk about these a little bit more going forward, but let's just go ahead and move into the mid slots for now. So next thing, because we're doing a kiting setup, we want to take a warp disruptor. Again, we want to place them as far apart as possible so that heat damage isn't overlapping on one another and they get damaged sooner and you can't overheat them as long. Also, always take a warp disruptor 2 when you can. That will give you an extra 4 kilometers of distance to work with. Finally, for the mid slots, well, as you can see here, we're not going to be capacitor stable with this setup, but 12 seconds is just a little bit too insane, a little bit too quickly. That's way too much to manage. So we want to fix that, and the only real way to do that, or to do it correctly anyway, is to do a capacitor booster in the mid slots. All right, so now we have a capacitor booster in the mid slots. Now we're probably going to put like Navy capacitor booster 400s, which I do believe is the largest we can put in a small capacitor booster. We probably still won't be cap stable, but that's okay, because we're obviously not going to be running all these things at the same time. If we're kiting, we're only going to be running our micro warp drive and our warp disruptor. And now the reason we have these energy neutralizers, even though they're short ranged and we're going to be kiting all the time, is you're going to get caught sooner or later. And getting caught you not having a web of fire, because we're using a small capacitor booster here, means that we need to shut down any of their propulsion propulsion modules. And to do so, we have these three neutralizers. Now, with another ship that you can only put one neutralizer on, because you're using the rest of it for damage, it's not going to be as helpful. Like with the Slasher, where we decided in the end not to put a neutralizer in, because one neutralizer is not going to be able to neut anything fast enough for you to be able to get away. At least not in most cases. But with three neutralizers, you're going to be able to neut them out completely. Then once you see that Scrambler turn off on your screen, you turn on your micro warp drive, get back at range, and start kiting again. Ultimately, this is going to make you near uncatchable in a lot of ways. On top of that, if you so wanted to brawl, you could manage your neutralizing, or if you had no choice to brawl, you could manage your neutralizing in a way that you will cap them out, because you're not running your micro warp drive, so your capacitor is not going to be hurting as much. You'll cap them out and still win the fight. So yeah, 3 neutralizers or a full rack of neutralizers, very scary stuff. Very scary stuff. So if you notice right now, if it isn't already bothering you, our power grid is blinking because we don't have enough power grid. Before we can get into the low slots, we need to address that. So there's 2 ways we can address it. We can address it in the low slots, or we can address it in the rigs. So if we address it in the low slots, we're talking about micro power auxiliary cores and things like that. I don't want to use the low slots. I don't like using the low slots. You might be different. You might want to try using the low slot, and hey, it might be a more effective setup. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to fix this power grid issue in our rig slots. So let's fix that first before we go any further. Going into the rigs, we're going to need an engineering rig. And we're going to use an ancillary current router. All right, good. That fixes our power grid issues. Now we can go into the low slots. So, as we said earlier, one thing that you always need to have in a Gallente ship is the damage control. So let's take care of that first. Boom. Now we got our damage control. Now, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to take advantage of the amount of hull or structure hit points that this ship has. Because if I fit in armor, or like an armor plate, we're going to hurt our speed, and our speed's already kind of bad. So with a micro warp drive. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and not hurt our speed by putting in some hull tank. So we're going to increase our effective hit points for our hull. So to do that, we're going to go to hull upgrades here, reinforced bulkheads, boom. All right, so now we're up to 3200 EHP. We've increased our hull, and we've not hurt our speed, as it is important for a kiter to have at least decent speed. Now, as you know, our CPU is blinking again. Or sorry, not again, but now our CPU is blinking rather than power grid, so we're going to go ahead and fix that again with our rigs. So let's fix that real quick. Again, we're going to go to engineering, and then we're going to want the overclocker. Here it is. Okay, boom. Now we just fixed that. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of room left here, right? So what can we put here? What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to throw in some resistances. But we've already done what we could for hull resistances, so instead we're going to throw in some armor resistances. And that might give us just that little bit of extra buffer from our armor to make it get shot one more time when we need that extra bit. So back to hull and armor. And we don't have any power grid or CPU left really, so we're going to have to use a resistance plating instead of energized plating. Energized plating is basically just passive resistances, but they use like 20 to 30 CPU, and we obviously don't have that. Well, resistance plating does the same thing for a slightly less amount, but it does not use any CPU. It only uses one power grid. So boom, throw that in there. Now we're real nice and tight. Okay, and finally for the rigs, the last rig we're going to be using is we want to add a little bit more buffer. So let's go ahead and go into our rigs. And we're going to be adding some more effective HB in our hull or structure, right? So here we go. Add the transverse bulkhead. So we shot up from 3,300 to 3,700. So there you go. We have an okay amount of effective HP buffer, but the important thing is we didn't hit our speed. We didn't hurt our speed, so we do have some time if we get caught to neutralize the enemy long enough for us to go back to our orbit of about 18 kilometers. And again, you'll want to add drones, of course. In this case, I have 5 hobgoblins and 3 warriors. You can go for a full rack of hobgoblins or a full rack of warriors, however you like. So even with this setup, we have 100, almost 100 DPS at 99 DPS. But this is a really safe setup. It's very risk averse. We can pretty much choose the engagements we want. We can kite pretty much everything except for a small tackler, and a small tackler will just newt them out and go back to kiting them. So meanwhile, our drones are just chipping away at them, and we know they're going to be applying damage really well. So that 100 DPS is going to go a long way. So we have a lot of options with this fit. If we really wanted to, we could go in and brawl with the neutralizers, especially if it's an active tank ship. There's not a lot they're going to be able to do with 3 neutralizers on them. Again, if you do decide to brawl, make sure you turn off your micro warp drive up close and personal, or just pulse it as you needed to maintain tank. Because you're just going to be neutralizing them, and that's going to take up a lot of your cap. You'll want to use Navy Cap Booster 400s here to get the most amount of capacitor boost that you can. But other than that, you can pretty much just kite them, circling at 18 kilometers, doing damage to them. They're not able to do anything to you. You got options if they catch you, and you got a little bit of buffer in order to enact those options. But yeah, that's it. This is how you Tristan, guys, and fly safe.